I would love to do it, please.
Yes,
Good
ma'am.
morning.
Good morning.
Okay, so I'm going to open with a prayer, very short prayer. So, Father God, when it comes to hard living, we remember you are the great I am and our source of strength and purpose for each new day. Help us in our advocacy efforts with the bread for the world to honor you with our work for justice, healing, and peace. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Amen. I forgot that we have a deacon here. So,
And chaplain.
It's
all right.
outstanding, but always got to make use of the tools you have available. And Patricia, thank you for that. I really appreciate that. Well, look, everybody, hello and welcome to this kickoff event for Systemic Diversity and Inclusion Group's celebration of Black History Month. My name is Earl Breon. Some of you may know me as one half of the Earl and the Man show combination there. I also host my own podcast on leadership development titled The Burden of Command, where we talk a lot about the diversity and inclusion topics and leadership related topics. We had a wide range on there. But today I'm honored to be joined by my partner at the Leadership Phalanx and the man of the Earl and the Man show, Mr. Richard Hill, as well as president of the Systemic Diversity and Inclusion Groups, Dr. Joseph Nwoye. So Dr. Nwoye, do us a favor and take a couple minutes to introduce who you are to the audience.
That's a good question. I'm glad you asked. I don't usually get that question. As you all know, my name is Joseph Nwoye. Already I'm seeing some people I know for a long time. So I'm very glad that you are here. I was born in Nigeria, and throughout my upbringing, I had parents who had cultivated what I believe propels me to do what I do. I went to school in Pennsylvania, and prior to that, I spent some time in Britain. Then I came to the United States. I did my undergraduate, 2 graduate studies, and then my doctorate. And during the course of doing this, I was put in environments that sometimes are mainly Caucasians, white Americans. But because of how I was sociocultured from the privilege of having the kind of parents that I had, who, by the way, passed away a number of years ago. They groomed me, they shaped me into becoming what I am. And that shaping of my behavior or how I work with people was instrumental to my fitting in, if you will, when I got to predominantly white environment, because I had been exposed to people of different races, different colors, from different nationalities. So all those things cumulatively helped to form me, to shape me, to become whom I am today. Without them, perhaps human frailties could have changed my perspective in life. I'm probably not gonna be who I am today. So with that, I'm gonna get it back to you. If you have more questions, I'll be glad to answer. Thank you.
Outstanding. Thank you, Dr. Nwoye. And Richard,
Yes,
take a
sir.
couple minutes and introduce yourself, please.
Appreciate that, Earl. So everybody, you probably are not familiar with me unless you've been watching the Earl and the Man show. I am the man part of the Earl and the Man show. But I hail from the great state of Mississippi, where I spent the formative years of my life learning about race and racism from a very non-active perspective, and I'll explain that a little later. But once I became a grown man, I joined the United States Army, and for 22 years, I traveled from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Korea, and 9 years in Germany. I tell you that story to make this point. Because I left Mississippi, my whole world perspective changed. When I was in the Army, I was introduced to what they call equal opportunity training. Now I'm a diversity director. When I started, it was all about counting people. Today, it is all about making people count. So I, for one, Dr. Nwoye, are greatly honored to be here today to help you kick off your week of our African American heritage observances. So thank you for the invite.
Outstanding. Outstanding. Thank you for sharing that. Now, a little bit of housekeeping here as we get going. Folks, if at any time during our discussion here, you have any comments or questions that you would really like to add, please feel free to type those in the chat box, and we'll get to those as time and fit allows. And that's kind of a standing rule through the discussion. Anytime myself, Dr. Nwoye, Richard have a comment or something like that, please, we want your interaction. So feel free to make use of that chat box. With that, Dr. Nwoye, let's kind of go back to you here a second, because you did a great job of introducing yourself. But take a couple of minutes and talk about Systemic Diversity and Inclusion Group, or SDIG. What is it? What's its purpose? What do you want to accomplish with this group?
Thank you. To really understand where systemic diversity stems from, I have to go back to what I had said earlier, that my parents, the social environment that shaped me, cumulatively drove my perception of people, that people are by and large good until something happens. And that belief could be encapsulated by one of the famous American writer, Mark Twain, when he stated, I quote, "Where you live really does shape who you are." It was true then, it's true today, or even more true today. So systemic diversity, or what we may call SDIG, is a manifestation of my educational experiences, and more importantly, my experience from my parents, who acculturated me into an environment where I had to relate to other people who may not be like me, but I felt comfortable in both environment where people are not like me, as well as the environment where people were like me. And at the time, I learned very early that people are by nature good. It's how you approach them or not approach them that changes the direction and behavior of people. However, there are some people we will characterize as simply bad people. But I still believe that what makes the difference between good and bad people is the experience they may have had. Now, granted, there are people who are really bad. Say, for instance, the Nazi in Germany, what they did to the Jewish people. The white supremacists, what they've historically done to African Americans. I can't believe that we are still hearing that some churches are being burnt. So that's to say that these are people who had limited exposure about other people. And more so, they've been indoctrinated to believing that they are superior, whatever context they may concord that in their minds, and that propelled them to begin to look at other people who may be different from them and developing the division we see around. Some of those divisions, some people will overcome it by covering it up well. And some people will be open about it. They speak about it candidly. If you want to know more about it, you can go to the South. You know, when they say something, that's crystal clear, as you know where they want you and where they don't want you. again, we have this environment that shapes us. And that again expresses what I had said earlier, Mark Twain's assertion that where you live does shape where you come from. A similar individual who made mention of that would be an American linguistic, Frank Smith. He reminds us that we are the company we keep. So, ladies and gentlemen, whether you have a good company or bad company, keep in mind that it shapes you. If you have good people around, you learn from them. If your friend does something that is bad, confront them. That's really true friendship. So systemic diversity stems from that, from the core belief that human beings are by nature good. And if they have some differences, perhaps because people have their different contexts of looking at one another. So the ideal way to overcome those differences will be to getting them to open up, confront difficult issues. In this country, we have misconceptions that people have developed over the years. We cannot overcome those misconceptions unless we honestly confront difficult issues, honestly discuss them, understand them. So that's the driver for systemic diversity. I've articulated many times that that forum is for those who are social conscious, people who want to create a society where everyone will feel a sense of belonging, a sense of being included, a part and parcel of that inclusive society. Former President Reagan usually say the city, the building at the hill, beautiful, and so on. Make everybody feel like they are part of it. So I believe that systemic diversity provides the forum for that. Over to you.
Oh, no, outstanding. Thank you for that. And I really appreciate it. And it's a noble mission that you got there. And I really appreciate you taking that that mantle on and putting this group together. There's a lot of great folks here in the group. And in my experiences, I think we're kind of meeting, at least on the way to meeting your goals for the group. So again, thank you for your vision there. You know, Richard, so as we mentioned before, we're here to help SDIG kick off their celebration events for African American History Month, or as it's more commonly known, Black History Month. And this year's theme is the Black family, representation, identity, and diversity. But before we get to unpacking that theme a little bit, I think it's always a good idea to start most stories at the beginning. So with that in mind, what is the history behind African American History Month?
Thank you for that question, Earl. And the answer is, it's the brainchild of a young Harvard-educated student by the name of Carter G. Woodson. If you're unfamiliar with that name, Carter G. Woodson was the second African American to graduate from Harvard University. He was preceded by W.E.B. Du Bois. But he obtained his degree in history of all things. But the history that he learned was mainly European history. There was no such thing as, well, Black history. But what happened, Earl, was in 1915, he had a chance to go to Chicago. And the reason why he went to Chicago, it happened to have been the 50th anniversary of the signing of the 13th Amendment, the amendment which freed the slaves. He was so impressed by the displays that he saw that were demonstrating the things that African Americans had accomplished in the 50 years since they'd been free, that he got together with some of his colleagues and they came up with an organization they called at the time the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. Today, that organization still exists, but it is now called the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. But every year, my dear man, they are the ones who give us the theme that you mentioned earlier. And so I just wanted everyone to know that there's a reason why we celebrate African American History Month or African American Heritage Month in February. Because in 1926, Carter G. Woodson came up with Negro History Week. He picked the month of February, not because it was the shortest month, as some people like to say, but it happened to be the birth month of two people he admired. Abraham Lincoln, the man who issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist. They both were born in February. In 1976, Earl, or correction, starting in the 1960s, students of color started celebrating the month-long celebration. And it was President Gerald Ford in 1976 who extended it officially to a 1-month observance with a presidential proclamation that has been issued every year since 1976. And so that is the origin story of Black history.
Outstanding, outstanding. So with that in mind, Dr. Nwoye, I know SDIG has been working hard to put together a kind of action-packed month, if you will. So if you got it handy there, take some time and share with the audience what all does SDIG have planned to celebrate African American History Month this year?
Thank you for bringing that occasion in place here. SDI has essentially looked into ways to celebrate this history, and we want to make it to be different from the regular ones. And therefore, we are coming up with 6 sessions of activities that will help us to begin to see the issues of history associated with African Americans. And today is the first one where we are discussing, and just general discussion to set the stage for what is going to be coming up. On February 11th, we will be having Black Military History of America. And that will be done by somebody who I admire so much, Dr. Karen Ingram. She will be taking us on a walk on those. And I will encourage you to tune in if you have time to do that. On Saturday, 12th of February, there will be one on education and the systems. That will essentially look at how education has been going on and what could be done. Because we are not only talking about the issues, we are talking about now that we are here, where do we go from here? On the 18th, there will be another one where you see these gentlemen, Richard Hill and L. Brion. They're gonna be working on similar thing with some added information. Then on February 25th, our new minted group, who are youths, will be addressing the issue of health inequity. And this will involve people from all over, because this is a global organization. Hopefully the youths will help us to reverse what our system, overt and covert system had created. And sometimes we try to see it differently because it reflects whom we are. Whatever our circumstance or context we may have learned, we cannot easily divorce those from our behavior. Then on the 27th, we're gonna have Miss Christina Smith, who will be focusing on self-care for diversity professionals. This program and the work of diversity is a heart-wrenching one. It's emotionally draining. So Ms. Smith, who has dealt with issues of diversity for a number of years, had indicated that we should have something for those who are in the trenches going through the anguish and all kinds of frustrations that are associated with it. That's essentially what we're gonna be having. And I want also to remind you that the Man and Al Brand's show, we have it every Thursday. Every Friday. It starts from 4:30 to 5:30, exactly 1 hour. And I can tell you that they're brilliant. If you are missing it, I urge you to tune in. At least try it. And you probably come to the same conclusion I came to. Brian, that's it.
Yeah. Hey, no, I appreciate it. Thanks for the plug there. Really appreciate it. And I put the link in chat there if y'all want to register. We really do lean heavily. We call it the Earl and the Man show, but we want the audience to participate in that very heavily. So sign up, register for as many as you can make. And for instance, this afternoon, 4:30 to 5:30, we're going to be talking about the real dangers of othering. And I think that is going to be an outstanding conversation, and very interested to hear y'all's input. Dr. Noye, thank you for sharing those festivities that are going to be going on through the month. I think there's going to be a lot of great topics, a lot of great discussion there. I do want to encourage everybody, if you're not already part of the group, join the Systemic Diversity and Inclusion group page on LinkedIn. All of these things get advertised there, so you don't miss out. They've had some really great programming and have a lot of great programming planned for the months to come, not just for African American History Month. With that said, I just want to remind everybody, if you have any questions as we get through this discussion, please feel free to throw that in the chat box there. We really want to hear what you have to say, and we're going to be talking about some things that maybe some of you know really well and maybe some of you have never heard of before. So don't hesitate to throw those questions in there, and we'll get Richard's take, we'll get Dr. Nwoye's take, and who knows, maybe if I feel intelligent enough, I might throw a little bit of a spin on it myself. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into this theme. Now, again, this year's theme is the Black family, representation, identity, and diversity. Now, this is a theme for 2021, but it's a theme that is really can trace its way back all the way 402 years ago when it comes to the Black family, all the way to the year 1619. Now, Mr. Hill, what is the significance of 1619 and its effects on the Black family in regards to representation, identity, and diversity?
So there's no singular answer to that question, Earl, but for the sake of brevity, let's focus on the theme part, representation, right? And so in 1619, history records that slave ships showed up in Jamestown, Virginia. The record further indicates that by 1624 or 26, the first Black child was born to the parents of Anthony and Isabella Turner. To this very day, if you go to Hampton, Virginia, you can visit the Turner Cemetery. But why is that important? You see, when we normally hear the word representation and Black folk, we immediately start thinking about the right to vote, the franchise. Quick point about that. It is true that that is a form of representation. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed, and half of the Black population earned the right to vote. Why did I say half? Because women did not receive the right to vote until the 1920s. And Black women in particular did not receive the right to vote freely until 1965 when the Voting Rights Act was passed. But what I wanted to focus on in terms of representation, Earl, is identity in terms of representation. You see, when you got on a slave ship, ladies and gentlemen, and you were placed there head to toe for a 30-day trip if you were lucky, I want you to imagine the horrors you must have went through in the belly of that ship. But that was just the beginning for you. Because when it comes to representation, my friends, you may have left Africa as a Nigerian, a Kenyan, or a Ugandan, But when you landed in Jamestown, Virginia, you had one single name, slave. And so your representation of a continent ended the moment your feet touched American soil. You lost all of your representation. You see, Mr. Breon, right now, if I wanted to go to an embassy from Scotland, I believe that's where your parents or your lineage is from, Scotland.
Yes,
you
sir.
could go to Washington, D.C. to an embassy. It's called the Scottish Embassy. I notice we have an international audience. I have no doubt they too can find an embassy representing their country. I told you earlier I was born in Mississippi. You know how many embassies I can visit as a so-called Black person in America that represents my lineage? Zero, because there is no such embassy called Black. And so this is what we mean when we say representation. The loss of representation among so-called Black Americans is incalculable. I mean, how do you calculate the loss of not knowing where you came from? And I would just end with this thought, Mr. Breon. Harriet Tubman, whenever you look at her birth date, they always put 1840 something with a question mark. We know when she died, they recorded that. But you see, when it came to representation, do you know, my friend, that when you were Black and a slave, they didn't bother to record your birth because you were considered property, not a human being. You didn't even have the dignity of a birth date. So that's what I wanted to share with that part of representation. And what does that really mean? It's more than just a right to vote.
You know, and thank you for sharing that. And, you know, as you and I have discussed, kind of leading up to this topic here is, you know, for me, growing up in Northeast Tennessee as a white male, and as you mentioned, the way history is taught, you know, I didn't really hear a lot of that in the history books. The first kind of introduction to that, if you will, was being a young man watching the movie Roots. And I remember that kind of very powerful scene where LeVar Burton is kind of hung up by his hands and he's being whipped. And the whole reason he's being whipped is because he's refusing to give up his African name and take on his English/Christian name. And what really struck me about that scene, even at a young age, was that it wasn't a white man who was, you know, wielding the whip. It was a fellow slave, obviously had been forced to do such things. But, you know, why was it so important for these new slaves and slave owners to strip away their identity of who they were?
So before we even get to that answer, you made the observation that it was another slave that was whipping him. That's called divide and conquer. That's called creating distrust among those who are slaves. And so they can't be conspiring to run away as a group because you don't know who to trust. After all, I just got beat half to death and the guy looked just like me. So the significance of that beating, Earl, was they were again forcing him to relinquish the country that represented him, or the continent in this case, Africa. His name was Kunta Kinte. And until he uttered the words Toby, which now does two things. A, it acknowledges to his white master he has been broken mentally and physically. And two, it said to him, for posterity's sake, you have now severed ties with the one place that represented your birth, that every child that will be born from this day to the next will have no idea of their heritage. Mm-hmm. That was the significance, my friend, of that stage, that image. But more importantly, my good man, that was one guy you saw. There were millions of Kunta Kintes being broken on a daily basis so that they too can forget where they came from.
Mm. Well, and that answer kind of ties in, that response ties in very nicely with one of the questions or comments we have here from Dr. Ingram. I'm wondering, with the DNA advancement of home test kits, how long will it take for a company to provide a kit for Black Americans to determine what area of Africa their genealogy was from. This project would greatly benefit African Americans in learning their tribal homeland customs, religions, culture, language, geographic area, etc. Now, I'll kind of leave this open to either you or Dr. Nwoye, and I agree with Dr. Ingram, but when you look at how the slaves were treated and essentially purposefully bred because they were traded like cattle, that might be a hard project to pull off, because there's probably going to be a lot of results that come out of that saying you have lineage that goes back to various parts of Africa, right?
Well, already, Earl, there are people who are using, I forget the name of the DNA company, something 21.
There's 23andMe.
Yeah. 23, and that's the one, I'm sorry, 23andMe. So they're already doing something like the good doctor recommended, and they're able to trace themselves to Western Africa, Eastern Africa, the sub-Saharan desert, blah, blah, blah. But whether they can get specifically to a village, like say you, Mr. Breon, it is possible that you could trace your lineage all the way to some fiefdom in Scotland if you went back far enough, because there are records that you can get to. But you have two problems with the African part of this conversation. If they had no written records from the beginning, so it's going to compound the problem. Then you add in slavery, where they were commingling people. And so now you got different tribes who are now, thanks to their masters, interbreeding with one another that would not have been otherwise. And so that's going to start changing things over time. And so probably the best you're going to be able to do is say, I'm from a particular country. But if that country is made up of several tribes, it's probably going to become more difficult to figure out which tribe did you actually come from.
Dr. Nwoye, is there anything you'd like to add, sir?
Yeah, I think I have to thank Dr. Ingram for that brilliant question. And that goes to the heart of what systemic diversity is planning. Because to begin that process, having the DNA may not be enough. Because if you look at the economic system, most of the people who could get that may not be able to afford it, to be frank with you. There's some economic component of it. But what SDIG is doing could facilitate the process, should there be the will to help in moving that forward. Because we all know that you are identified by what you believe. Ashanti, former chair of Temple University Department of African Americans, once said that in his trip to a number of African countries, he found that when he got to certain places, he would see people that would say, oh, that one looks like his dad. The other one would say, oh my God, that looks like his uncle. There's some sort of optimism and re-emphasizing of who you are, that those things will resonate when people hear it. And let's get to this society. When you hear of people who developed this and developed that and so on and so forth, then you look at certain people who want, when they go to school, all they have to be subjected to is talking about slavery, how they've been, how their culture, their forefathers, and this has always been done X, Y, and Z. It's really, really terrible that educators, psychologists, those who are in the area of being informed, don't really conceptualize that. And that sometimes it makes me cringe. I question, what does education mean if that's not happening? So Dr. Ingram, as I had said, thank you for that question. I would say that people should begin to look into how can they help. SDIG is now forming the youth wing of our work. And this youth wing will constitute people from all over the world. We have people from Australia, We have the Aboriginal people who could talk about their own plight. We have people from Africa who talk about their own plight. You know, if you remember, there was a time here when the Irish people will come and they say, organization would put application for people to apply, but they say there clearly, no Irish need to apply. Now, what I'm saying is that this is type of thing people go through. And today we know how the society is, who are the ones not educated. I have students who will tell me, oh my God, I see that in my former student, they will say they see some teachers whose behavior reflects what we taught in the class, what I had always pushed for, which is don't judge people. Some people may not be doing well because of their cultural background, because of the context of education. Some people are placed in an area where you can see continuity, and others are placed in a place where you see discontinuity. The people who are placed in place of continuity experience good school reflecting their society. And people in bad situation are placed in a place where it's like we versus them. What the school wants is not consistent with what they're doing. So that underscores the importance of our trying to use the DNA to help people to identify themselves, because it's empowering. Back to you, Brian.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And again, Dr. Ingram, thanks for the question. Miss Patricia, you had something you wanted to add?
Quickly, before the baby started chatting, I was thinking about the DNA ancestry. I could see the pros and the cons with that. I think it's a good thing to learn where we're from and all that stuff. But the cons, I wonder if the police uses the same system to locate people. For example, I'll just say if my mom did something wrong, God forbid if she does, she's 80, so she should be cool. If she did something wrong and my DNA is in the system, or her I don't really know how to put this, but the con for me, I would just think that if something happens that's not always good, will the police come on my job to say, we got a hit of a relative that did something and we just need your advice or your help? So I think there could be some cons to that as well. I may not be saying it correctly, but that's just my thought for right now.
Well, I would like to address Patricia's concern, if I may.
Please do, sir.
You know, Patricia, and anytime there's a new innovation, there's always the danger of abuse, right? So for instance, when we came up with fingerprints, people could plant your fingerprints somewhere and accuse you of a crime, right? When they came up with blood typing, people could drop your blood on the crime scene and say that you were here. And likewise, Patricia, as you are on this phone call right now, they are tracking you electronically. And so if they wanted to abuse that innovation, they could do so as well. So you are correct when you say, I must weigh my pros and cons, and only you can decide whether the weight is con or pro. That's an individual decision that I don't think anybody on this call can say, Patricia, you should or shouldn't participate. What you should be, Patricia, is fully aware that potential for abuse exists in everything in the world. Surely you would agree.
And again, I'm not a lawyer by any stretch of the imagination, but I would imagine, and it's a good question and great concern, as everybody has mentioned, but some of this information is going to be protected. I don't know how much, but some of the information sharing is going to be protected by GINA. And full disclosure, yes, I had to look it up because I couldn't remember what the acronym was, but the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. Now, to the full extent that it answers and helps your question, I'm not 100% certain, but just to prove it's a valid concern, we have addressed that a little bit through some type of legislation. So, this is a good conversation. Great question so far. Really appreciate everybody for chiming in. And we had Mr. Sedley made a comment that I think kind of segues really nice into our next piece here, because he says, There may be various embassies from homelands, but why can't Black be as much American as white American? White America may have roots, but they consider themselves to be American first. Interesting thought. Now, when you look at Black history, from, again, this is from a white perspective, from my perspective, it seems that there are three very distinct kind of time periods, if you will. There's 1619 to 1865, which is kind of the slavery era up until the abolition of slavery. 1865 to 1964, kind of that gap between the abolition of slavery and the Civil Rights Act, and 1964 to present. But in that history time period, what Mr. Adams says there wasn't always true, right? We had Irish Americans, we had Scottish Americans that were kind of segmented out from one another, and that kind of unification, if you will, of whites into white versus Black was intentional, wasn't it, Mr. Hill?
Indeed, Earl. All you got to do is think about the census. You know, I get to choose whether I'm Black or African American. When you get to choose, what does it normally say for your selections? Does it say Irish or German or French?
No, it usually says Caucasian.
And the reason why that is necessary, ladies and gentlemen, did you realize that if they were to do it by country versus whiteness, there would be no majority in America. There are just as many African Americans as there are Frenchmen in America, or Irish or Scottish. But if you make them all white, then they become a super majority. So there's a representation reason for making whiteness a thing. But the way Sedley asked his question, Earl, and at least the way I understood it, that Blacks should be like whites and see themselves as Americans. So therefore, what do they need an embassy for?
Right.
And when I was mentioning the embassies earlier, Sedley, it wasn't in the vein of saying Black people need an embassy. It was about representation, that when you come here as an immigrant, in the 1840s, thanks to the Irish potato famine, Ireland almost emptied out its entire country to the United States. That to this very day, there are more Irish in America than there are in Ireland. Yet, most Irish can trace their lineage back to Dublin or wherever else it may be in that country they came from. And so if they wanted to learn more about it, they could go to their embassy and start asking questions. But if you are Black and wanted to learn more about your lineage, what embassy do you go to? Because you, like everybody else, is not a Native American, because those are the only true Americans. Everybody else either got here through slavery or voluntary immigration. Therefore, if you don't have a connection back to where you came from, you can easily fall to being defined by whatever anybody else say you are. Let me give you a prime example of my point. We're going to talk about identity in a moment, Mr. Breon, so I'm going to preempt it just for a moment. You see, there's been this iteration of names that Black folks in America have either been called or referred to themselves as. One word they were called was a derogatory term, the N-I-G-G-E-R word. Once slavery was over, we were upgraded to colored. In fact, the United States Army had colored troops. The NAACP was the National Association of Colored People, and I could go on. But then that went out of vogue. It was no longer in vogue when we had this great awakening in the 1970s. And all of a sudden, well, correction, in the 1940s, we went from colored to Negro, the Negro Urban League, and so forth and so on. By the 1970s, say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud. Black is beautiful, Miss Black America. And now, since 1988, we've been referring to ourselves as African American. And so there's this crisis of identity that can be traced directly back to the fact you don't know where you come from. Because if you knew where you came from, you can simply hyphenate your name as Irish American, Scottish American, and you only have to do it once. The reason why Black folks keep wrestling with their title, because each generation redefines what it means to be a former occupant of Africa who now resides in America. So that's my 2 cents worth on identity, Mr. Breon.
No, I appreciate that. Dr. Nwoye, do you have anything to add to that, sir?
Well, I think he has put it in perspective. I would just say that whether it's identity or different morphings of title, going back to 1865, if you go then, you see the atrocious things that were happening prior to then. Then you see that we are emancipated, still the same thing kept going on. And, it brought about using the identity or respect for African Americans as a negotiating chip between the South and the North, which led to the Jim Crow era. And that continued. The pain and suffering, anguish never reduced. And then we moved to 1965. They say civil rights. The pain, if you don't know much of this, just look into history, how people were sent dog to, how water holes were used, how police targeted African Americans, looking at Martin Luther King Jr., what those people endured. And then fast forward, getting to today. And in each period, the distance between the time it began and the time second one came and the time the following one came, there may be reduction in the magnitude of pain, but it's still pain. And for me, I associate those things with a system that will negotiate the identity of certain people as good and the identity of certain people as, so it's ingrained in the fabric of our society. So it's kind of difficult to come to an end. But I think that the death of George Floyd may have given us opportunity to begin to understand, to begin to conceptualize these things. Because would I say I kind of call it like a double problem, or if you want to call it this virus we are in there, we are now talking about injection and all those things, talking about negative aspect of it, then talk about systemic racism that being historical, that is in the plain sight. I feel like for anything that happens, if you look deeper, you see the advantages as well as the disadvantage. You call it pro and cons. I will advocate that people may begin to look at, we are here. What can be done to change this situation? It's not good. We all know it, black or white. If you're in, say like every month you hear Department of Labor reporting the number of African Americans that are unemployed. And some people have gotten into a debate where some people say, well, if they're not employed, perhaps there may be something else. I'm not talking about apple and orange. I'm talking about apple and apple. If you look at African Americans with high school and look at the white with high school and compare them and go to people with Bachelor of Science and compare them, you go all the way to PhD and compare them, you continue to see the same thing. And that's why I feel like these terrible things have been normalized. We don't even talk about it. It has become normal. So George Floyd's death gave people a common window through which we can see very vividly what is happening. The question is, are those we call leaders able to look into it and say, these are all our people? These are the steps we can take to overcome these things. And again, we have some people who benefit from it, who will sustain their practices because they feel as though there are certain people that will vote for them based on how they see them, and there are certain people that will not vote for them based on how they look at it. I'm not picking a political side, but if you want to know more, look at Republicans. Let me just be very clear. Look at Republicans. Watch their advertisement. Watch their political campaign. Just go and look. Take a look. Don't do anything. Just don't get into research. Just take a look. And when you look at it, whom do you see? If they are not reflecting you, that means that they are not seeing you.
Amen.
If you go deeper, I see a congressman who said in Pennsylvania that he fixed the election for Romney. And probing it, I read a couple of articles on that. He effectively stopped certain people from voting. And that's what he characterized as having done that. Now, we talk about free election. We go to other countries and say free election, but here we consistently impede the people's ability to vote. So it's a matter of policy issues that I believe that if those in policy making could really look at the nation and see everybody as an American, they can come up with things that could at least reduce some of these pains. And I can go more, but I think I better drop it here and transfer it back to you, Brian.
No, good points. Good points. Thank you for making those. And, looking at the time here, we've got about 6 minutes or so left, so we can be cognizant and finish on time. So give you gentlemen a good, 2 or 3 minutes each here to just kind of talk about, we've talked about the history. We've talked about the theme. How can we move the needle forward? Dr. Mboye, how can we really kind of move things in a more positive direction?
Thank you very much. I think that question really goes to the heart of my position, goes to the heart of what motivated me to come up with this systemic diversity. Because we have this systemic problem, we have to have systemic solution. Anything outside that will not work. So what does that mean? It means that we're going to begin first by educating people. And I would say every individual to look at him or herself and begin to rephrase it. What can I do? What can I learn to help me understand? When I see my friend or closest friends, when they do these atrocious things, what position do I take? You say, oh, it's okay, and you walk away and everything is fine? No. You have to confront that as an individual. You have to do all you can to indicate to the person that he or she is not truly a good friend because you don't believe in those type of things, that you believe in fairness for all. And more importantly, SDIG has now developed a point where we support any individual or organization that has something to share to move the needle to prevent these atrocious stories we hear every day. On the educational front, as I alluded earlier, I have students who send me things here and then that they could not believe what they're seeing. They see teachers who are having all these degrees, but when they come to the class the first day, they have determined who is going to make it and who is not going to make it based on the pigmentation of people's skin. It's terrible. And now I shift back to schools, universities. But again, I'll say, well, universities, schools, communities is microcosm of the society. So I would put it back that people should be doing all they can, but at the same time, focusing on organizing. SDIG platform has opened a new opportunity. Right now, we have youth group comprising of people from at least 6 countries. We have Europeans, we have Africans, we have Americans. Engagement, confronting the problems head on, honestly. Truth will only bail us out. Subjugating it or pushing under the drug would magnify the problem. And because of time, let me not to go deeper. Back to you, Brian.
No, I appreciate that. And Mr. Hill, same question. And I know you like to usually leave folks with a kind of a historical anecdote to kind of round things out. So how do you see we move things forward? And what is your little history bomb you want to drop on us to close it up?
So real quick, ladies and gentlemen, to me, we're being presumptuous when we say to move things forward. That presumes that we've moved at all. Here's what I mean by that. We never seem to learn the lessons of history. You see, in 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed, without a doubt, the Emancipation Proclamation. But what he didn't do was make people ready for change. He didn't sell to the Southerners the need to end slavery. He forced the Southerners to accept the end of slavery. And so what he did was build up white supremacy. In 1964, we passed the Civil Rights Act. Again, Johnson, Lyndon Baines type, LBJ, did not reach out to Southerners, of which he was one. He actually said, we have now lost the South for the next 100 years. So that means he knew then he had not done the things, Mr. Breon, that was necessary to bring people along. So you would think we have learned our lessons, right? But we haven't. You see, Dr. Nwoye mentioned George Floyd. But I will point out to my good man, Dr. Nwoye, that long before there was a George Floyd, see, that insinuates emotions and empathy. Emmett Till in 1955 was a 14-year-old, murdered, so horribly disfigured that his mother made the decision that the world should see what white supremacy had done to her 14-year-old son. In 2012, a 17-year-old Black child was murdered, not by the police, but a vigilante, Trayvon Martin. Again, we'll protest and we'll do all the things that are energy dispensing, but we never do the hard work. And so I want to leave you with this thought. Dr. Carter came up with the 8-step change process. And here's what he said in just the first 4. Establish a sense of urgency. Lincoln didn't do it, Johnson didn't do it, and we today haven't done it. Form a powerful guiding coalition. I ask you, who is your coalition? Create a vision. We don't have a vision in America, we have visions with an S. And last thing I will point out, he said, then communicate the vision. Until we do those things, while I believe that we can move forward, you cannot move forward unless you realize there's a need to move at all. Earl, I told you I like to share a little tidbits of Black history that most folks may not have heard of. And so as a treat to this audience, I wanted to let you know that when you hear about pseudoscience and how they use science to define the Black family, which is part of our theme this year, Mr. Breon. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to introduce the audience to a word you may or may not have heard of. It's called drapetomania. Drapetomania, spelled just like the word drape, T-O, and then mania. What that means in Latin is basically you are crazy to run away as a slave. A guy by the name of Dr. Samuel Cartwright came up with that theory, drapetomania, to explain to white slave owners, if you either treat your slaves too well or too poorly, and you don't convince them that God said they should be slaves, then they will run away. That is an actual theory you can Google right now. Drapetomania is about runaway slaves and why they thought you were crazy to run away from slavery. Little known facts of Black history. Earl, that's all I have, my good friend. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, no, again, thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. Thank the audience. You've been great. A lot of great comments, a lot of great questions. I think it's been extremely informative and hopefully a great way to kick off the celebration of African American History Month with our good friends at the Systemic Diversity and Inclusion Group. We look forward to seeing you at the events that Dr. Nwoye mentioned at the beginning. And I'll speak for Mr. Hill there, say we would love to see every one of you at the Earl and the Man show. It's a partnership with SDIG between them and the leadership phalanx. That's Pete and I. Every Friday, 4:30 to 5:30, we talk about different topics around diversity, inclusion, and leadership. So you can mark it on your calendar. We're going to be there. We're like the geysers in Yellowstone. We're as regular as can be. So 4:30 to 5:30 every Friday. With that, thank you all for being a great audience. I really appreciate it. And yeah, go enjoy the rest of your day.
Well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. And, stay tuned.